106.2 FM, from Israel to the world.
Special interviews, highlights, and live broadcasts from ICT's annual international conference.
Hello and welcome to IDC International Radio on 106.2 FM. I'm Sabrina Zeloof and we have a special coverage of the 17th Annual World Summit on Counter-Terrorism. With me today in the studio, I have the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Magnus Ranstorp. Thank you for coming in today.
Delighted to be here.
Now, you are a researcher on terrorism at the Swedish Defence University. You also work for the EU in their Radicalisation Awareness Network, which is actually a network of 3,000 practitioners who work on a daily basis to counter extremism. Is that correct?
That's right. They're out in the street. They're meeting all the extremists.
Wow. So you've got quite a robust biography in counterterrorism. Tell us how you got into the field.
Well, I mean, Iran, really. The Iranian Revolution in 1979 sort of was happening when I was becoming a university student. And I asked myself a really interesting question. How come Iran used terrorism as a sort of proxy weapon to exercise influence over the United States, France, and the UK? And we had the hostage crisis throughout the 1980s. I was really interested in that. And then, of course, I did my PhD in the University of St Andrews, where Prince William went later on. We didn't teach him.
He met his wife there.
He met his wife there. We saw him. My students were quite proud because he didn't make the grades to international relations. He didn't have enough A-levels or whatever entrance requirement we had. But you know, I came to Scotland right after Lockerbie, and I visited the town of Lockerbie. The plane had impacted on the ground. So you had the international terrorism, you had Northern Ireland around the corner, you had the Middle East in flames. You had a bit of a run-in with the IRA. Well, yes, I did. I mean, when I first started, I went with my mentor. We organized a conference at the Royal Overseas League in London behind the sort of Ritz. And the defense minister was going to be there. We had heavy security, they did sweeps and so on. And the IRA had planted a porter. And that porter, in a security lapse right before the conference started, he taped a lunchbox, lunchbox with Semtex, about 1.5 pounds of Semtex, with an explosive velocity of 6,000 meters per second. Everyone would have been dead. 100 people would have been dead. And the sound technician found it when he looked underneath. He was fixing some cables. And it's because of that sound technician, I'm alive, and
wow.
and that was
everyone else.
Exactly, and that was like, you know, welcome to this world of terrorism. And this was not some ivory tower, incident.
It was a wake-up call.
The same year I visited Israel for the first time, and trying to understand.
What year was that? 1990.
1990, you know, my focus then on research was to try to understand Hezbollah, and you know, at the time the civil war had ended in Lebanon. What is this entity, Hezbollah? Of course, the focus was on terrorism, so I was interested in you know, how do you resolve those incidences? What is Hezbollah's connection to Iran and Syria? So I began mapping out that, and that was, of course, before the internet. So I had to go to the archives. I had to go. I mean, I spent a lot of money on photocopying, but you know, you really had to go and retrieve and interview people. So
yeah,
I went
you got very close.
Well, you know, after I finished my PhD, then I did 2 papers at Oxford. You know, stupid enough to do 2 papers, not just one. And you know, I think that it was very interesting. I was asked to be sort of a back channel between Israel and Hezbollah, as I was a messenger boy, really.
This was at the time when Israel was withdrawing from South
Yeah,
Lebanon?
I mean, I had a lot of conversations in Israel with Israeli officials, politicians, and others, and we were trying to. I mean, I think that the sort of basic premise was right in relation to why I got involved, and that was there was UN Resolution 425 that you know, Israel would withdraw down to the border. But then also there was a humanitarian issue about MIAs and about hostages and so on. And so I did a little bit of, I had this double existence between teaching my students in St Andrews and then either going to Beirut or to Tel Aviv for many years, and then it became public. Actually, I think it was TV2 in Israel who revealed.
Exposed you?
Well, I mean, they said I had contributed to the debate. I was very proud of that. And then I had another round of involvement right afterwards, because you had the 3+1 with the 3 soldiers and Tenenbaum issue, and I then sort of became involved with Gian Domenico Picco, who's resolved all of the Western hostage crisis, to see what could be done. And there was also very interesting meetings with people about the fate, and this was about the fate of trying to get back MIAs. And you can then imagine that it was quite an interesting, sometimes scary, because you also walk into the lion's den, and
also it's a very emotionally charged topic. You know, either way, no matter how these things get resolved, there's a lot of public opinion and public pressure.
Well, I mean, I try to stay neutral in this. And my role was then to try to help and to resolve that. And I think, and also I was, recognized for having done that. So I have evidence that actually happened. But it is very emotionally charged. But you have to divorce yourself from that, and you have to
look for a solution.
You have to look for a solution.
But at the time, Hezbollah, you said you were looking at its kind of terror wing, and now it's evolved to much more than that. Today, a lot of Israeli officials will recognize Hezbollah as one of the most imminent threats, with their missile arsenal pointed at Tel Aviv.
Yeah.
Is that something that could have been predicted, prevented? How do you see it?
I mean, I've always had an open mind about Israel, and Israel warned a long time about the missile threat. Many others said yes, there is a missile threat, but we were a bit skeptical. But then, of course, the wars came with the rockets, and in 2006, and we saw really the arsenal, and how Iran was involved. So I have to say that one shouldn't take these threats as skeptical. I mean, they're very real. And what I see now is, the funny thing is that everyone joked with me during the 90s. I was working on Hezbollah, and then everyone said, well, they're going to withdraw from the security zone. Your career is over. So I then moved to Hamas and met many Hamas leaders and tried to map out, what is the social, political, military behavior of Hamas. But then again, now it's coming back. It's coming back full circle.
Hezbollah has not died.
No, I mean, I'm quite worried actually, because I think that this is a complicated neighborhood. You have a lot of. I'm worried about the fact that Hezbollah has 140,000 rockets. That the next war will be very damaging.
Very catastrophic.
Yes, but at the same time, Israel is facing, there are weapons manufacturing happening in Syria and Lebanon. At what point do you intervene in order to prevent an even larger disaster? And will Hezbollah and Iran turn against Israel?
Well, I think the hope is that we've kind of reached, it's almost like a mutually assured destruction or a deterrence, where Hezbollah's, their potential of harm towards Israel is kind of as a warning, saying if Israel approaches Iran, this is going to be the direct consequence.
Exactly, and I think, and also, I think that, but there is, the risk of miscalculation, and there is, how can you control all the sort of different reactions? But it is a very live front. And we should be focusing on that. So I think that, I will be revisiting that area. I think it's really interesting. It's really it's important for the region's security that we are aware of the Iranian Shia crescent that has been forming and so on. So I think that one could have predicted some of these factors.
Okay. I want to ask you another question now. Coming from Sweden, a lot of people associate Scandinavia in general and Sweden in particular as being really the beacon of liberal values and human rights, etc. Does that pose, does that maybe clash with effective counterterrorism if we talk about things like rights to privacy and profiling, things that perhaps don't go along with liberal values but are needed to effectively counter terrorism?
I think, one should be cognizant of the importance of valuing civil liberties, freedom. I mean, it's a very difficult balance. I mean, my mentor was Professor Paul Wilkinson, who wrote the first book, Terrorism and the Liberal State. So I've been sort of fostered into always thinking about, don't give up too many, for security reasons. But at the same time, you have to also be more effective. Every society have their own codes as to where are the thresholds.
But if we talk about these thresholds, doesn't matter where you draw the line.
Yeah.
The foundational first human right is the right to human life.
You're absolutely right.
And counterterrorism, if you say, okay, you know what, we value privacy more than the right to life, then it's easy to say, okay, then the NSA won't tap phones, and we're not gonna racially profile, and we're not gonna invade your privacy, but your life may be in danger.
That's right, but at the same time, one also needs to have check and balances on states. I mean, otherwise they start looking into everything you do. They probably can, but it's good.
They probably are.
They probably are, and it's not just one government; it's many governments. But at the same time, one needs to have that balance. I mean, if I look at Sweden today, when it comes to legislation, laws that put away terrorists and so on, it's very difficult to apply that law, and therefore we don't get a lot of convictions, and the sentencing could be harsher. I mean, the huge difference in different countries between how long you get put away for a terrorism crime. So, I mean, I think that I wouldn't hold up Sweden as a model for how do you counter violent extremism. The security services and the police are doing a good job, but they're only part of what is necessary. And the radical Salafi jihadi environment in Sweden is larger than one thinks.
Yeah, you have these so-called no-go zones.
Well, I wouldn't say that they're no-go, but they're highly segregated areas which the police have sometimes difficulty operating in because they're criminal gangs and they attack police and so on. But they're a very small group of gangs that are really holding society or those communities. They make a lot of trouble for them, and
for sure.
And therefore it's difficult to operate in them, and it's also where some of the extremists are hiding. We did a study on Swedish foreign fighters. There are 300 who went to Syria to join Daesh. Yeah, and we had data on 267 of them. The average proportion of women were 25%, a little higher than most of the Europeans. So
it's because the Swedish ideology is very feminine.
Well, maybe that was a funny way of putting it. But I think about 70-80% came from 4 areas, and they all were segregated areas.
So, look, if you collect that kind of data, someone will say, okay, well, then the answer is obvious. We need more involvement here. We need stronger de-radicalization, which is something that you have researched and you're involved in.
Yeah.
Does de-radicalization actually exist?
I would say it's more disengagement. Depends on what you're talking about. Yes, the de-radicalization may exist in certain areas where you have a lot of extremism in Africa and other places where you have de-radicalization camps, where you have youths who have been sort of indoctrinated and you try to de-radicalize their thoughts and their
And in the West, I mean, we know that radicalization is a real problem.
Yeah.
But once someone's radicalized, can you really effectively counter that ideology? Can you replace it?
It's usually about identity and belonging. If you're a young person, it all depends on how deep into. And sometimes you have different types of people who become involved. You have those who went to Syria who were adventurous. They are violent. They use the violence. They're interested in weapons. They seek the thrill seekers, and they use ideology to justify why they went. Then you have those who are born into extremist families, and that's really, I mean, there are actually extremists that are groomed from birth into an extremist environment, and those are very difficult to change. And then you have those who seek belonging, who seek to belong to a group.
It's a psychological need.
Yeah, the psychological. So I guess to answer your question is that I think the best one can hope for really is disengagement, and over time.
What do you mean by disengagement?
Well, I mean, what they do, for example, in Aarhus, Denmark, is that they identify individuals who've been involved, either coming back and so on, and they have dialogue with them, and they go into their families, and they say, look, you are on a destructive path. We would like to talk to you. We would like you to talk maybe to a psychologist. And what the psychologist does is to open up new avenues of, that they can go into, that they can change their life. And that's an investment, because the people that meet these people are then sensors. They can sense where's the radicalization path, where's the trouble, and they can have early warning flags. But then at the same time, look, it's an investment in security, because if you can deviate someone from not becoming violence promoting, you're
saving lives.
You're saving lives and saving society. But let me say one thing, and this is quite important. That is that the Salafi jihadi ideology, there is no gliding scale of radicalization. They are anti-democratic. They only believe in God's rule, but they're violence promoting. That's part of it. They distinguish everyone who's not with them or against them, even Muslims, even Shia, even others. So that's really difficult, and it may be more difficult to do that. And also very difficult to de-radicalize someone when they live in a community, when they are being pressured by other community members, when they're visited by other people.
It seems that perhaps almost, you'll have Swedish or whatever Western authorities, psychologists, de-radicalizers, practitioners, but they're the minority, whereas the overwhelming majority of where these people are is a very surrounding an environment that encourages going back to this kind of violence.
And that's why you have to break segregation. It's really difficult to segregate, to work in that environment.
Do you think, though, that perhaps resources should be invested, perhaps even more so, in preventing radicalization in the first place? So let's say going to schools with younger children before, and being conscious of what kind of influences they're getting from home, and kind of be aware of that.
Definitely, because it's very difficult. What do you do as a teacher when someone sort of shows up and they have, IS videos on their phone? They show logo. They even come in maybe with a T-shirt with IS, and that's not illegal. So how do you take that conversation when you have really radical views? That's one thing. The other thing that is somewhat problematic is perhaps, how do you break people from being isolated to meet other cultures and so on. For all the students here at IDC, there is the sort of Inglehart World's Values Survey, which measures collectivism, individualism, religiosity, and the Scandinavian countries are really extremist because we are very secular, and we're also very individualistic. And how do you create sort of meeting points between cultures, between those who've been in Sweden always and those who come to the country? How do you create those meeting points and so on? That's everyone's responsibility.
For sure.
And to also work towards try to get inclusion rather than exclusion and marginalization and so on.
Well, this has been the answer to that question. I don't know, but I hope that next time we meet Dr. Ranstorp, you'll have the answer or more answers to how to really alter the fabric of society to be less violent, I guess, at the end of the day.
Well, we can hope. But it's delighted to be here. I just want to say thank you to particularly at the conference or the World Summit on counterterrorism. I particularly wanted to say to all the student helpers that you are real ambassadors. It's really delightful to be here. I want to thank all of them for their really hard work.
Yeah, everyone who's volunteering.
All the volunteers who are here, because that smile from every single person who is greeting you is very infectious, and I know how much hard work it goes into it. So I want to thank everyone from all the helpers up to Stevie Weinberg, Boaz, all the people that have been involved, because you're making this a fantastic experience as a visitor.
I'm so happy to hear. Thank you so much for coming in.
Pleasure.